The womb is a trap, Philip thought to himself. He caught its reflection in a shop window and slowed his pace, taking in his furrowed brow, his stooped shoulders. The trap was pressing down. Bonnie was already naked when she answered his knock. He peeled off his pants without a word and followed the promise of her bottomless gaze. Afterwards, she lay on the sheets, afternoon light making a triangle across her flat belly. She smoked and didn't look at him. Judy's pregnant. He hadn't really meant to say it out loud, but there it was, echoing among the sounds of the traffic from the street below. And he swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached down for his socks. And I don't know what to do about it. Your part's already done, champ. She smirked as she watched the smoke coils hanging in the air. Fuck you, it's not funny. You know Judy, she'll expect marriage and happy family life and all that. Bonnie sighed and crushed her cigarette into the ashtray on the nightstand. Why are you telling me this, Phil? I don't know. Maybe I should marry her, carry on the family line or something. She got out of bed and slithered into a silk robe. This doesn't much concern me, you know. I've been fucking you for almost as long as Judy and I have been together. You've been fucking others for almost that long. Whether you're married or not isn't going to stop you from fucking me or anyone else, so why drop all your angst on me today? Her hands were on her hips, and her face was a perfect mask of bored contempt. Philip buttoned his shirt savagely. Okay, sorry. Just thought you might have some advice for a friend. Bonnie glided over to the bedroom door and stood on the threshold, clearly ushering him out. I advise you to quit bothering me with your bullshit. You want to fuck? Come on by. You want a bitch? Call your therapist. Phil stomped the 3 blocks back to work, hands jammed in his pockets. In the elevator, he stared at his reflection again, noting the dark circles under his eyes, his ever more sloping posture. He didn't know why he had told Bonnie anything. For the rest of the afternoon, he simply sat in his office with the door closed, staring at the computer screen as if his own thoughts were projected there. When the clock finally struck 5, Phil shrugged into his jacket and drifted out of the building, robotically wishing his coworkers a good weekend. His walk home was just as automatic, but halfway there he found himself standing in front of a glass door, emblazoned with 3 gold spheres. A bell jingled as he pushed it open. Help you? The woman behind the counter was white-haired and regal, with pale, searching eyes. He approached, his movements molasses thick. The jewelry in the case was a riot of color, all seductive winks and fragmented images. His finger tracked along the rows of diamond rings. That one, he said. It looked much like the others. Very good choice, the woman said, bending at the knee to slide the blue velvet box from its place in the lineup. She'll just love it, I suppose. The corner of the woman's mouth curled upwards. You don't sound so sure about this. She put the box on the counter and peered up at him from beneath her lashes. I'm just nervous, I guess. Of course. Phil freed the ring from its plush prison and gave it a perfunctory once-over. It was a solitaire ring with a brilliant cut stone and a thin white gold band. It seemed adequate, classic even. He noticed as he moved the ring back and forth, the diamond flashing and then darkening. He caught a glimpse of his own haggard face in the stone's depths before it disappeared again. How much? The woman chuckled. Normally that would be 3, but I like your decisiveness. 25. Phil handed over his credit card. The money didn't concern him. The implications of that tiny white gold shackle did. He slipped the velvet box into his jacket pocket and left without another word. Judy was arriving home just as he did, clad in her hospital greens and carrying a plastic grocery bag in each hand. She greeted him with a smile and a kiss on the cheek as he opened the door to the apartment building. I got a couple steaks for tonight, thought you'd like that, she said, her bags creaking as she fumbled around for her keys. Sounds good. I'd actually love a cocktail, though, if you could fix me one. She held the apartment door open with her butt as he went past her. Sure, baby, let me put all this stuff down first. Phil downed one cocktail in a single gulp, and then moved on to a second. The smell of steaks frying permeated the apartment, a secretive bloody tang. The TV was on, and he sat on the couch looking at it, drink in hand, but nothing on the screen was making any sense to him at all. Judy called him to dinner, and he turned it off. He had a third drink and then a fourth. He had taken off his jacket and slung it across the recliner, but he could still see the square protrusion in the pocket, like the rectangle of dirt covering a fresh grave. Judy, for her part, didn't seem to notice anything amiss, humming as she washed the dinner dishes, prattling on about some funny incident at work. He half listened, smiled where he was supposed to. After a while, she settled on the sofa with her tablet, her pleasant face lit by its blue glow. He let another 2 hours pass before he glanced at her. His heartbeat was a death knell. "Judy?" She looked up. "I have something for you." He reached across and pulled his jacket into his lap. Judy watched him, sweetly curious. When he pulled out the ring box, she sat up straighter, and her eyes filled with tears. She let her tablet slide off to the side. He opened the box and held it out toward her, an offering. "Will you marry me?" He felt as though he was speaking around a mouthful of sand. Her tears spilled over and she laughed a girlish laugh, a sound like a tinkling bell. "Oh, Philip, you didn't have to, because of the baby and everything." He realized he was still holding the ring box in one outstretched hand like an idiot. He took the ring out and slid over to her, taking her hand to put it on her finger. "It's not because of that," he said. "I just wanted to. I felt like it was time." She stared down at the ring with something like rapture, then met his eyes. "It's beautiful, Phil, and yes, I will. I love you." She threw her arms around his neck and kissed his forehead, his ear, the corner of his mouth. Her tears left salty dampness on his skin. "Love you too, Judy." He returned her kisses, hugged her tightly around the waist. The ring sparkled in his peripheral vision. In the reflected light from the TV screen, the stone almost seemed to turn black. He was still awake several hours after Judy had fallen asleep beside him. She had been especially amorous after his proposal, and Phil had tried, but the 4 cocktails and the thoughts of his impending marriage and the shitty day he'd had conspired to prevent even a glimmering of an erection. He'd apologized, shamefaced, but of course Judy had forgiven him. She always forgave him. In the moonlight streaming in through the blinds, he could see her hands folded across her stomach, see the slyly winking diamond on her finger. Underneath that stone, underneath her folded hands, a piece of him was growing. He shifted his position on the bed and punched his pillow into a more amenable shape. He imagined Judy's belly inflating in seconds, like a balloon attached to a helium tank, and then exploding in a rain of blood and gobbets of flesh. Scowling, he closed his eyes, wondering what the fuck was wrong with him. Judy rolled over in her sleep, and her hand flopped onto his chest. He opened his eyes again. The ring was inches from his face, its facets reflecting the room back at him in insect vision. As he stared at it, he thought he saw a trickle of dark liquid emerging from it and snaking its way down Judy's finger. He felt wetness on his chest as the fluid dripped. He picked up her hand between 2 fingers and cast it away in disgust. Judy stirred but didn't wake. Phil sat up and looked down at his bare chest, but there was nothing there. Judy's hand, now resting on the sheet, was clean. On Saturdays, Phil had been in the habit of going to see Bonnie, or sometimes Rachel, while Judy was working her long shift at the hospital. Today, though, he slept until several hours after Judy had gone, and by the time he awakened, he felt so dire that leaving the house for any reason was out of the question. He managed to stay on his feet long enough to shower and shave, staring at himself and wondering who the old man in the mirror was. The sound of breaking glass brought his razor up short. Blood bloomed in a thin line across his jaw. Swearing, he grabbed for a tissue, pressing it to his face as he stumbled back into the bedroom. He got his pistol from the nightstand and slid the drawer closed quietly. The sound had come from the kitchen, he was sure. The silence in the apartment pressed around his ears like a wool blanket. Slanted light painted the hallway as he crept along, feeling vaguely ridiculous with the gun held shakily out before him. The kitchen was deserted, as was the living room when he peered out across the bar. He set the gun on the counter and let out a breath, scanning the area for the source of the sound. There was nothing fallen, nothing broken. He snatched open the cabinets and stared at the rows of gleaming drinking glasses, innocently intact. He blinked. The glasses darkened, clouded, as if a shadow had passed before the window, and he spun around. For a moment, he thought he saw a sort of shimmer, a bright rain of color bursts hanging in the air. When he blinked again, they were gone. He scrubbed at his face, scowling when his hand came away smeared with blood from his cut. "Christ," he said to the empty apartment, and even his voice sounded old, muffled by the close atmosphere. He had to get out. Rachel wasn't surprised to see him, but she wasn't thrilled either. "Don't you ever call?" "I was just going stir-crazy. Haven't been feeling very well." Phil sat stiffly on her futon, withering under the gaze of Pluto, Rachel's imperious Maine Coon. Poor thing. Want some tea? Maybe later. Come here. He pulled her down into his lap when she approached, and thrust his hand under her shirt. She pressed her body against his, straddling his legs. The cat jumped off the futon with a squall. 15 minutes later, Phil was hunched at one end of the futon, his pants back on but still unbuttoned, a cup of tea growing cold in his hand. Pluto had returned to his place, swishing his tail in triumph. "Well, you did say you were sick." Rachel's voice was flat. "Sorry," he mumbled. "I don't know what's wrong with me the last couple days." "It's no big deal, really. You'd have had to go soon anyway. I have things to do." She was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, her skin like smooth stone. "Yeah, so do I." He finished his cold, gritty tea and set the cup on the coffee table. When he stood up, his pants sagged and slid halfway down his ass. Rachel smirked as he yanked them up and buttoned them. For the rest of the afternoon, he wandered the streets, not wanting to go back to the empty apartment. It was a pleasant fall day, crisp and sunny, but everywhere he went, he felt as though he was enclosed in a dusky fog. He met the eyes of passers-by, but their gazes seemed to slide past him. When he grew tired of walking, he ducked into a coffee shop and sat at the window, nursing a latte and watching the huge, indifferent world bustling past on the other side of the glass. "Did you have a good day today?" She asked this every Saturday when she came home. He threw his head back and emptied his beer down his throat. "Does it look like I had a good day?" Judy flinched, but when her expression settled, there was only concern for him there, no anger. "Sorry, baby. I thought you looked a little sick last night." "Yeah, I think I'm sick." His momentary rage had dissolved, and he felt suddenly exhausted, claustrophobic. "Probably going to be an early night for me." "Need me to get you anything?" Her eagerness to please was giving him a headache. He waved her off and she went into the kitchen, where he heard glasses clinking together and the sound of water running. He put his beer bottle between his legs and sighed. For a second, he entertained the notion of going into the kitchen and telling her about the noises he'd heard earlier, but the desire dwindled as quickly as it had appeared. Instead, he staggered into the bedroom and fell asleep without even taking off his clothes. He awoke a seeming instant later. He was lying on his back, and the room was hot. He moved his head and saw that Judy was also on her back, snoring softly beside him. Her stomach was an enormous mound beneath the covers, and it was then that he realized that he was dreaming. Slowly, he reached over and slipped the sheets off her engorged belly. Distantly, he noticed that her diamond ring was now on his finger, the stone like an obsidian eye. The flesh of her stomach pulsed. Phil watched it, curious to see what would emerge, but then, with the certainty of dreams, he understood. He placed the edge of the diamond against her belly button and sliced downward in one swift stroke. A ragged red fissure opened, blood pooling along the lips of the wound like quivering rubies. Inside was a riot of shifting, refracted light, illuminating the room like floodlights in a swimming pool. Phil curled his fingers around the edges of the chasm and pulled, widening the wound, intensifying the glow. The brilliance was now so blinding that he had to turn his head, and when he did, he heard a faint sound of a baby crying, very far away. Philip awoke for real, his heart thudding, his sweaty hair pasted to his forehead. He felt his fingers, which were ringless, and a quick glance showed that Judy slept on, her still flat midriff rising and falling at a steady rhythm. He swallowed and heard his tongue click. Then another sound. A baby crying. Phil sat up in bed. It could have been coming from one of the other apartments in the building, of course, but he'd never heard a baby crying in the building before, and it sounded close. He looked down at Judy again, but she hadn't moved. He slid out of bed. The room seemed darker than usual, with barely enough moonlight to see by, and he felt assaulted by some gray miasma whose tendrils insinuated themselves into his nose and mouth. The crying grew louder and higher pitched as he made his way toward the kitchen. He couldn't believe that Judy hadn't heard it too, and the fact that she hadn't made him think that perhaps he was still dreaming. But no, everything around him was real and solid, and he could feel the wood floors slick beneath his feet, the cold walls beneath his fingers. The kitchen was empty, but the sound of the baby crying was very loud. In the perfect square of the window, the moonlight was a solid, featureless white. The air felt suspended. Phil waited, hardly remembering to breathe. The baby keened and wailed, the sound coming from everywhere at once. He covered his ears, but he still heard it, now as intimate as a sigh. The moonlight around him was flickering, a living thing. He didn't know how long he stood there. The baby's cries eventually waned, like a fading radio signal, and Phil dropped his hands to his sides. It took a while before he was able to place one foot in front of the other, to push against the air that hemmed him in. The hallway before him seemed to stretch into forever, its angles skewed and fractured. He walked it like a blind man, keeping his arms extended for balance, staggering this way and that. He opened the bedroom door. The darkness was nearly complete, and he strained to see. Swirling clouds moved before his eyes, revealing the bedroom as he had left it. Except that Judy was standing very still at the foot of the bed, staring at him. No, not Judy, something else. Phil froze. It was a woman, or the likeness of one. Her hair was white and hung in straight curtains on either side of her face, partly obscuring it. Even so, Phil couldn't help but feel that she was familiar somehow, her face a barely there memory. She was naked, and her breasts were pale globes that sat atop a monstrously pregnant belly. It was here that Phil's comprehension of what he was seeing began to break down, for her stomach looked as though it was made of a polished faceted diamond, all glinting prisms. Below the diamond was simply a smear of white that suggested legs, though at their extremities they seemed to drip, showers of falling stars that sizzled and vanished into the floor beneath her. But all of that wasn't the worst, for Phil could see that there was some small squirming thing moving inside the diamond in her belly, something that seemed to be staring out at him with two shining black eyes. He thought he screamed, but he couldn't have, because Judy didn't stir. The apparition hovered there for no more than a few seconds, but to Phil it looked like time had stopped. The thing inside her belly pressed closer against its prison, and the facets of the diamond distorted its face into horrible geometric puzzle pieces. Still it stared, its eyes like holes. Phil didn't see it fade or wink out of existence. It was suddenly just not there anymore. He blinked and let out a ragged breath. The room appeared completely normal, the objects becoming a little more distinct as the first rays of dawn began to creep in through the blinds. Judy slept, peacefully oblivious. He stood very still for a long time, watching, listening, starting at the slightest sound. He stood this way until morning had broken fully, and the room was filled with a pleasing, diffuse light. At long last, when nothing happened at all, Phil moved slowly to the bed and settled in beside Judy, resisting the childlike urge to pull the covers over his head. He stared at the ceiling for what seemed like hours, thinking he would never be able to fall asleep again after what he had seen. He was still thinking this when he drifted into unconsciousness. Everything was in pieces when Phil opened his eyes, reality painted on fragments. For a long time, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. There were the walls of his bedroom and the ceiling, but they were all awry, the angles a crazy patchwork. Here was a glimpse of the blue comforter, there the sliver of a lampshade. As he struggled to fit the fragments of the picture together, he noticed fractions of flesh, the curve of a jawline, the arch of an eyebrow. Then suddenly he was in motion, his body lifted as though it was no more than an atom's weight. He threw out his arms to steady himself, but they were boxed in, and his legs were likewise useless, folded painfully beneath him. All at once, the fragments turned completely flesh-colored, and then for a moment he saw nothing but a gigantic ice-blue eye, staring at him like the eye of a god. Another motion and he realized that he was looking into Judy's face, enormous above him, her expression uncharacteristically hard and venomous. He thought he screamed, but he heard no sound. He remembered his dream from the night before, and this seemed all of a piece with it, but also achingly real, as the white-haired woman standing by his bed had been. He realized with a start that he was seeing his fiancée from the perspective of the ring upon her finger, the ring he had so carelessly bought, the shackle that would tie him to her symbolically, just as the creature growing inside of her tied him to her biologically. The huge fragmented woman above him gave a terrible smile, a wide-toothed rictus, and then he was moving again, lower and lower, watching her body flash past him in a series of triangular flickers. Then it was all flesh again, growing larger and larger in his vision, and as the ring moved closer, he realized he was now poised just above her belly, the midline of her abdomen as stark as an ink line on white paper. There was very little resistance as the diamond penetrated the skin. For a moment, Phil saw nothing but red, and then the brilliant play of the stone's light blinded him. It was a long-shadowed late afternoon, and Julia was staring dully into the refrigerator, not hungry but feeling as though she should make something or eat something, just to be going through the motions of a normal task. From outside, there was a whispery crunch, as of someone moving through the carpet of fallen leaves in the backyard. Julia turned, wondering if it was some early trick-or-treater approaching from the rear, or a teenage curiosity seeker on a dare, come to see the house on the fateful anniversary. She moved to the window. In the middle of the backyard was an old swing set that Scott had always played on as a child. Next to it was a black goat, standing upright, wearing a drooping red bell collar, furry horns twisted, black bead eyes motionless. The goat had a human hand where one of its hooves should have been. Julia put her own hand to her mouth. The goat stood, looking toward her and not moving. She didn't know if it could see her or not. She almost called for Bill, but then remembered that he was gone, of course. The last echo of him a shouted expletive and the roar of a car engine. Julia was alone. Hesitantly, she went to the back door and peered through the curtains. The goat was still there, but it seemed to have shifted its weight, and as she watched, it turned its horned head to one side, as though considering a course of action. "Scott," she said under her breath, his name like a talisman. She turned the knob and opened the door. Before she could step outside, before she could repeat the name, the goat had turned and dashed awkwardly off into the shrubbery, leaving a panicked flurry of crisp red leaves in its wake. Julia stood on the threshold for a very long time, staring at the space where the goat had been. The longer she stood there, the more she was able to tell herself that she had seen nothing but her own wishful illusions. But she was not able to completely convince herself. And so as night began to close in and the faint laughter and squeals of children began to float on the frosted air, Julia went back inside and called the police. Inspector Jim Wright was almost ready to go off duty, but he took the call and agreed to stop by the Langley house on his way home. Whatever Julia Langley had seen, it had upset her immensely, and even if it was just a sick prank, Wright felt compelled to check it out. He liked Julia a great deal, and genuinely felt for her. That business a year ago had been terribly ugly. When he got to the house, Julia was composed, though her eyes were a little red. "Thanks for coming," she said, and offered him coffee, which he accepted. While she went to make it, Wright wandered out the back door and made a slow circuit of the yard. It was full dark now, of course, but Julia had turned on the floodlights mounted on the house's eaves, and they bathed the area in a stark white glow. Even so, there was nothing to see. The space near the swing set, where Mrs. Langley had seen the goat, was unremarkable save for a few trodden leaves. Wright trudged back to the house and slid into a chair at the kitchen table. Julia placed a steaming mug in front of him and gave him a rueful smile before sitting down herself. "I'm perfectly willing to accept that I imagined the whole thing," she said without any prompting from him. "I don't think I did, but maybe the stress is getting to me more than I realize. Where's Bill? Did he see it?" Julia's gaze was flat over the rim of her cup. "I told him to leave." Wright sat back in his chair. "When was this?" 2 days ago. So under stress is something of an understatement, Wright thought. Not only was it Halloween, the first anniversary of her son's disappearance, but now this. "Mrs. Langley, Julia, I know this isn't really my business, but..." She gave him that sad little smile again. "Christ, Jim, after all you've done for me, you're like family. Don't worry about getting into my business. You know there was never any real evidence that Bill had anything to do with it." "I know. It wasn't just about the disappearance or about that girl." Her voice on the last word was hard as diamond dust. Clearly, she still suspected Zoe of something, even if the police had released her. Julia took another sip of her coffee. "I just felt like Bill was never fully on board, you know? Sometimes I thought, well, it was almost like he didn't really want to find Scott." This did not surprise Wright as much as it probably should have. Scott's disappearance had brought forth some scandalous accusations against Bill, and even if they weren't true, the stench of them was hard to erase. Wright had to admit he felt a little sorry for the guy, though he never would have said as much to Julia. She was really the one getting the worst deal out of all this, after all. She'd lost her son, her husband, her peace of mind, and now it seemed like somebody was fooling around in her backyard, trying to make the whole thing into a joke. Wright leaned forward, getting down to business. "So you saw this person through the window?" "Yes, I saw him clearly. He ran off before I could get outside." Her gaze drifted to the window above the sink, which was now a dark rectangle partially concealed by curtains. "It was the same costume Scott was wearing when he disappeared," she said quietly, still not looking at him. "I remember it because the horns were crooked, one slightly bigger than the other, and the bell collar was red, and of course one of the hooves was missing. Her voice shook a little, but she held herself together. She had told him about the goat's human hand on the phone, and this was the detail that most disturbed him. Scott Langley had disappeared on Halloween night exactly 1 year before. He had been dressed as one of the 3 Billy Goats Gruff. His girlfriend Zoe was the troll, while their 2 friends, Alan and Tiffany, played the parts of the other 2 goats. After Scott's disappearance, one of the only traces of him found by police was a single furry hoof from the goat costume. The inside of it had been streaked with blood. It had been found floating near the edge of the muddy stream under the Woodborough Bridge, 2 days after Scott had gone missing. Julia was looking across the table at him now, her eyes deep pools of rage and sorrow in her otherwise calm face. "I don't know what all this means," she said. Wright knew she wanted to believe she'd seen Scott out there in her backyard, but he also knew that she was realistic enough to understand that her son was probably dead. Julia was justifiably upset, but she wasn't delusional. So if the person in the goat suit had really been there, and if it wasn't Scott, then who was it? Some kid with a morbid fascination with the case who was getting his jollies out of toying with a grieving woman, or someone who knew exactly what had happened to Scott that night. It was the same costume Scott was wearing, I remember it. Memory was a funny thing, Wright thought. It was possible all this was a fantasy or a misunderstanding, but until further notice, he was going to operate on the assumption that Julia had stared into the masked face of her son's killer. Technically, the Langley case was still open, though Wright had been the only one doing any work on it for the past 4 months. He had taken the files home after his stop at Julia's house and planned to look over them for the rest of the evening. He had also phoned back to his office, telling the night officer to be on alert for any strange reports of a man in a black goat suit wearing only 1 glove. Wright made more coffee and settled onto the sofa in his small but neat living room. His cat Agatha purred and rubbed against his leg, then jumped up beside him and promptly dozed off. The apartment was otherwise quiet, the only sounds the faraway hum of traffic and the tick of the clock on the mantel. The exact facts of the Langley case were worryingly ambiguous. On Halloween night of 2009, Scott Langley had gone to a costume party at the home of a vague acquaintance, Susan Hawthorne. Accompanying him to the party was his girlfriend of 18 months, Zoe Beamish, and 2 other friends, Alan Young and Tiffany Grandy. Scott and Zoe had gone to the party in Zoe's car, a 2001 Nissan Altima. Alan and Tiffany had gone in Alan's battered Ford. At around 9:45 p.m., according to Alan and Tiffany, who had corroborated each other's stories, the 4 of them had left the party and driven to Woodborough Bridge, which was a fairly common hangout. They drove there in their separate cars. They had brought along some beers from the party, and after a bit of coaxing, admitted to possessing some marijuana as well. The 4 friends talked, drank, and smoked for more than an hour, still clad in their Halloween costumes. At around 11:15, Scott appeared to be getting intoxicated, and he and Zoe began to argue. Both Alan and Tiffany claimed that Scott made accusations of infidelity toward Zoe, which she denied. He became verbally abusive, but Alan was able to calm him down, though according to him, Scott still seemed morose. The mood of the get-together had soured, so Alan and Tiffany left just before midnight, both under the impression that Scott and Zoe would make up and then follow them back to the party at the Hawthorne house, that a phone call confirmed was still in full swing. Alan and Tiffany arrived back at the Halloween party at about 12:30, according to witnesses. They did not immediately worry when Scott and Zoe did not arrive, though Tiffany phoned Zoe and got no answer. Finally, at 10 to 1 in the morning, Zoe returned Tiffany's call. She sounded strange and very upset, and claimed Scott had been acting bizarrely and had disappeared into the woods. She said she had looked for him, but after 15 minutes of calling and wandering around the muddy banks, she left him to fend for himself and drove off. Her parents confirmed Zoe arrived home shortly after 1:20 a.m. When Scott had not returned home by the following morning, his mother called Zoe and all her son's other friends, then called local hospitals. Coming up empty, she finally reported his disappearance to police. At this point, Wright looked up from his files, staring absently at the wall and stroking the head of his sleeping feline. He remembered Julia's initial phone call. Much like today, she had seemed tight-voiced but calm, though he could sense the underlying panic threatening to spiral up and overtake her. The case had initially seemed cut and dried. Scott was 17, he'd had a fight with his girlfriend, he was out drinking and smoking dope with his friends, he had probably just gone off and slept in the woods, or at the home of a friend his mother didn't know about. Wright had told Julia Langley all this in order to reassure her, but even then he had the disquieting sensation that there was more to the boy's disappearance than met the eye. Julia certainly seemed to think so. Despite his attempts to minimize her fears, she would not be mollified and seemed to resent his efforts to calm her. Wright had begun an investigation. Various clues collected over the course of the next few days seemed to strengthen Wright's hunch about the case. Droplets of blood that proved to be Scott's were found in the mud near the bank of the stream, as well as on the wooden slats of Woodborough Bridge. A small knife, also discovered in the mud, had a streak of Scott's blood on the blade. Its handle contained a partial fingerprint, but its owner could not be determined. Scott's blood, though only a few spots of it, was found in the trunk of Zoe's car. The glove of Scott's goat costume was discovered near the stream, as though it had been tossed off the overhanging bridge. Wright had brought dogs in to cover the area, and they had followed a scent another mile from the site where the glove was found, but then lost the trail. No other trace of Scott turned up after that. At Julia's insistence, Wright had searched Scott's bedroom, watching the team pick meticulously through the detritus of an average 17-year-old boy's life. Nothing was found to indicate that Scott had been depressed or considering suicide. No phone numbers or addresses of previously unknown friends were discovered. The only significant piece of the puzzle was a plain black diary that looked fairly new and only had a few entries in it. The final entry, dated October 30th, 2009, read, "Found out about Z and my dad, can't believe if it's true. They might do something if they know I know about it. Z has been acting crazy and strange, and now I know why." When asked about this diary entry, both Zoe Beamish and Scott's father, Bill Langley, vehemently denied any relationship between them. Zoe also denied having anything to do with Scott's disappearance, and claimed she had no idea how Scott's blood might have gotten into the trunk of her car, or onto the mud near the bank of the stream. Wright leaned back on the sofa, rubbing his eyes. This was the kind of case he hated. Seemingly tauntingly simple, and yet riddled with vague clues and unknown motivations. He had questioned Zoe Beamish and Bill Langley himself, and while going in, he had wanted to dismiss their alleged affair as the overdramatic fantasies of a jealous teenage boy. Wright found he couldn't quite discredit the story entirely. Bill Langley in particular seemed a little off, a little secretive. Wright could easily see how Julia had gotten the idea that Bill was not especially diligent in wanting to track down his son. And Zoe was an enigma all on her own, careening from vituperative diatribes about Scott's character to tearful proclamations of undying love to flat-eyed, emotionless silence. Wright was sure he had earned more than a few ulcers during the few months when the investigation was hottest. So where did things stand now? If Julia was to be believed, and Wright thought she was, at least for the present, someone wearing Scott's black goat costume was lurking around in her yard for some unknown purpose. It could have been Scott himself, of course, but Wright doubted it, even if the kid was still alive, which was unlikely. Where on earth had he been all this time, and why would he want to torment his mother that way? More likely, something stranger was going on. The person in the goat suit might also have been Scott's father, Bill, or even Zoe, who was taller than average for a girl. Alan and Tiffany were also distinct candidates, though they had been nothing but cooperative during the entire investigation, and didn't seem like the types of kids who would pull a horrid stunt like this. And then there was also the remote possibility that Scott had stormed off into the woods that night and into the path of some random psycho, the kind of guy who would kill a nice 17-year-old kid for no reason at all, and then parade around in the kid's costume to satisfy some of his freak urges. If this was the case, then Julia Langley herself might be in danger. Wright would have to keep a close eye on her. After Wright had left, Julia locked all the doors and windows tightly, drew all the blinds and curtains, and extinguished the front porch lights to discourage trick-or-treaters from pounding on the door. Although she did not know it, everything that had been going through Wright's mind about the case had also gone through hers, in much the same order but at a more feverish pace. She had no idea what the person she had seen wanted from her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be a warning or even a threat. She had to admit to herself that when she'd first seen the goat standing out by the swing set, she had immediately thought it was Scott, who wouldn't have. But after it, had turned to run away, she got the distinct impression that the goat did not move as Scott had. Her son had always been lithe and graceful, with a gazelle-like lope to his walk. The person in the goat suit had seemed slightly bulkier, clumsy, as though not in complete control of his limbs. Part of this might have been due to the cumbersome dimensions of the costume, but not all of it. The fact that Julia couldn't think of anyone who moved the way the goat had filled her with creeping unease. She sat in the living room, the TV on but muted, and watched the closed curtains as if she could see through them, imagining the black goat with the twisted horns and the human hand standing out there in the dark, forming a shadowy maypole for costumed children running laughingly around it in the whirl of a great pagan ceremony. This vision was so intense that at last she rose quickly to her feet and swept the curtains aside. But the yard was empty in the cheery orange light from the jack-o'-lanterns lining the porches on the opposite side of the street. Wright's cell phone chimed at a little past 11 p.m. He had dozed off sitting up on the sofa, files still spread across his lap, his hand resting loosely on Agatha's head. At the sound of the phone, he snapped instantly awake, startling the cat so much that she yowled and leaped to the floor, fixing him with a withering glare before sauntering off with her tail in the air. Wright brought the phone to his ear. Yes? Hey Jim, this might be nothing, but one of the officers patrolling near that Walgreens on 44th said he thought he saw someone in a furry costume with a red collar getting into a black Ford Mustang that had been sitting in the parking lot. Wright's heart rate jumped. That drugstore was less than 3 blocks from the house Julia Langley now lived in alone. Did he get the plate? Sure did. He was going to follow the car too, but it had taken the highway exit, was long gone by the time the officer got turned around. The plate number's 4E37HA, registered to a Daryl Shaughnessy, residence at 1884 Emerald Avenue, Bridgeton. The name didn't ring a bell, but Wright's heart was still pounding. It was the first lead they'd had in months. Had the Bridgeton police been alerted? Yeah, I spoke to an inspector over there, named Sherry Rayburn. If you want to ride out with her when she goes to pay them a visit, she'll expect you by midnight. Think you can make it by then? Are you kidding? I'm halfway out the door already. This was not entirely true. In actuality, he was trying to straighten up the files that had slid off his lap in his excitement, and simultaneously searching for his shoes, which seemed to have been sucked into the black vortex beneath the couch. Give me her number, I'll call her when I'm on the road. Wright wrote the number on the edge of a manila folder when the night officer gave it to him, then thanked him for calling and rang off. He found his shoes at last and slipped into them, then pulled his keys out from where they had jammed in his pocket. He dialed Rayburn's number as he left the house, and when she answered, he gave her a brief rundown of the Langley case, explaining that this Daryl Shaughnessy was just a person of interest at this point, whether he was the man in the costume or not. After the call, he sat in his car for a few moments, wondering if he should phone Julia to let her know what was going on. It seemed cruel to build her hopes up when all this might turn out to be a big dead end. Besides that, it was getting late, and she might have already gone to bed. But he hesitated only a moment before deciding that if it was his own child who was missing, he would want to know about every scintilla of police work being done to find him, damn the hour or the false hopes. He scrolled to her number and called. As soon as the headlights of the police cruiser washed over the driveway at 1884 Emerald, Wright had a feeling this was the place. He didn't see a black Mustang, but the garage door was closed, and he could see the flickering blue light of a television coming from behind the curtains, indicating someone was home. There was a large carved pumpkin sitting on the front porch, already starting to go punky around the cut edges. There was no light inside it, but Wright could see that it had been sloppily carved into a leering devil's face, with a large rusty steak knife protruding from its head in an oddly jaunty way. As they mounted the wooden porch steps, Rayburn in the lead, Wright saw the twitch of a curtain out of the corner of his eyes. Rayburn knocked on the door, firmly announcing, "Bridgeton Police, please open up." For a long moment, Wright wondered if anyone was going to answer. Rayburn knocked again. Finally, the door opened a crack, revealing a shadowed figure wearing a blue-lit aura from the television. "What do you want?" "Do you or someone in this house drive a black Ford Mustang, tag number 4E37HA?" Rayburn asked. The shadow fidgeted. It was clearly male, a large form with vaguely lumpy proportions. Wright noticed that despite his large size, his movements were curiously furtive, like those of a bashful child. "I can't drive," the figure said in a small voice. "We're looking for Daryl Shaughnessy," Rayburn said. At this, the figure straightened and backed up a few steps, opening the door wider. "My cousin," the voice said in a much brighter tone, almost one of excitement or pride. Now that the door was opened fully, Wright could see another figure perched on the edge of the sofa, a rangy boy in ragged jeans and an orange t-shirt that said costume across the front in bold black letters. Black and white images of a heavily browed Bela Lugosi pulsed across the TV screen. Wright recognized the film as White Zombie. There was a bowl of candy on the table next to the sofa, half filled with empty wrappers. The boy, presumably Daryl, got up from the couch and slowly approached them. Even in the dark, Wright caught the dirty look Daryl flashed at his cousin. The cousin evidently saw it too, for he flinched as if struck. Now that Wright had a better view of the person who had opened the door, he could see that it was just a kid, 14 or 15 at most, and that he appeared to have some sort of mental impairment. Wright immediately felt a surge of pity for the boy. Did he know that his beloved cousin might be a murderer? "Can I help you?" Daryl said, now leaning in the doorway. He was quite a handsome young man, with longish blonde curls and brown eyes like a puppy's. He looked nervous and more than a little cocky. "You're Daryl Shaughnessy?" Rayburn asked. "Yes." Was it your black Mustang parked in the lot at the Walgreens on 44th Avenue this evening at approximately 10:25 p.m.? He paused as if he wasn't going to reply, but then his face split into a crooked grin. Yeah, I took Junior here trick-or-treating and I was waiting for him there. Kind of a long way to go just for trick-or-treating, Wright observed. Daryl shrugged. Not much action around here. You get better candy in the nicer neighborhoods, you know. Do you know Scott Langley? Rayburn asked abruptly. Wright saw Daryl hesitate, but only for a second. No, he said. What costume did your cousin wear when he went out trick-or-treating? Wright asked. Daryl's brow furrowed. They were rattling him, and that was good. I think it was a horse or a cow or something. Rudy loves animals. That grin again, but this time less assured, more like the wide rictus of a fearful chimpanzee. You sure it wasn't a goat? Wright said. Might have been, Daryl replied. It wasn't a very good costume. Where did you get it? It was just an old one we had lying around. Wright crossed his arms. You're sure you don't know Scott Langley? Daryl's dark eyes flared. Of course I'm sure. Look, is all this leading to something, or are you going to piss off and leave me alone? As soon as the words were out of his mouth, he clearly regretted saying them, but to compensate, he pressed his lips together in apparent defiance. Let me run down the scenario for you, Wright said, aware that Rudy was standing close behind Daryl's shoulder, eyes wide with terror. Someone in a goat costume was seen standing behind the home of Julia Langley. Julia Langley is the mother of Scott Langley, who disappeared a year ago wearing a goat costume very similar, if not identical, to the one this person was wearing. This person was then seen getting into a black Mustang registered to you, Mr. Shaughnessy. Am I making myself quite clear? Daryl just pressed his lips together tighter, but behind him, the cousin began to wail. I just put on the costume because Daryl told me to, the kid said between tears. I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. Shut up, Rudy, Daryl snarled, which only made the kid cry harder. Wright looked straight into Daryl's dark eyes. Did you kill Scott Langley? He asked quietly. No. He dropped his gaze from Wright's, but then sought it out again. No, I didn't kill Scott. Do you know who did? Perhaps inadvertently, Wright glanced at Rudy, who was shaking like a leaf over his cousin's shoulder. Was Daryl protecting his mentally challenged relative? Daryl was staring at the two inspectors, lip twitching, clearly mulling something over. Wright silently coached him. That's right, Shaughnessy, he thought. Just tell us everything and get it over with. At last, he seemed to have come to a decision. Come in, he mumbled. Upstairs, first room on the left. Wright and Rayburn exchanged glances, then simultaneously unclipped their pieces from their belts. Rudy was trembling so violently that Wright expected him to break into fragments, but Daryl just looked resigned. You won't need those, he said, raising his hands in the air with just a twinge of mockery. We're all unarmed. We'll keep them handy if it's all the same to you, Rayburn said, stepping over the threshold. Daryl shrugged again. Neither of the boys moved as the inspectors made their way slowly into the living room. Could one of you tell me where the lights are, please? Rayburn said. Rudy started to move toward them, but Rayburn barked, Stay where you are. Rudy froze with a tiny shriek, tears streaming down his cheeks, a long line of snot dangling from one nostril. Wright hoped the poor kid didn't die of a heart attack on the spot. Daryl pointed to a plate on the wall near the kitchen, and Rayburn sidled over and flicked on all the switches. Everyone blinked for a few moments, adjusting to the glare. The living room looked flat and dingy under the cheap ceiling fixtures, like an abandoned stage set. The lights over the stairs had also come on, and Wright was glad of that. He didn't like to admit it, but the whole scene was beginning to freak him out a bit. This sad, dirty little house out in the sticks, the two boys staring up at him with their respectively blubbering and unreadable faces, Bela Lugosi glaring out from the TV screen, as if he too was watching and weighing in on the proceedings. Not to mention the anxiety over what they would find in that room upstairs. He had a feeling that this Halloween might give him enough nightmares to last for a lifetime. Rayburn went first, since it was her jurisdiction, and when she had reached the top of the stairs and the long darkened hallway it led onto, she felt around along the wall, looking for another light switch. After a moment she found it, and the hall was flooded with a sickly yellow glow that put Wright in mind of insect lights, or of the slowly rotting flesh of the carved jack-o'-lantern outside. There were 3 doors, one of which was open. Wright could see a pie wedge of chipped gray linoleum and the edge of a pink porcelain bathtub. They approached the first door, hands on their guns. The sound from the television was muted, but still drifted up the stairs with eerie strains of distorted organ. Rayburn glanced at him, and he nodded. She placed her hand on the doorknob, held it there for a moment, then turned it and slammed the door inward in one fluid motion. The room within was dark, but in the faint glow from the hallway, Wright could make out the unmistakable form of a human being, sprawled across the bed. There was a stale scent in the room, the sour odor of unwashed clothes, a tang of sweat, even a very slight metallic whiff of blood. Wright had a second to ponder and be grateful for the lack of a strong decay smell before Rayburn flipped on the lights. There was indeed a figure on the bed, a gangly boy of late teenage years, black hair falling upon the pillow. His back was turned toward them, and he was very still. As Wright stared, he caught a glimpse of glossy black out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head slightly. In a ratty old armchair in the corner was piled a misshapen mass of shimmering ebony fur. In a flash, Wright had made out the shapes of gray cloven hooves, and even caught a glimpse of red that was presumably the collar with its silver bell. The way the costume sat upon the chair made Wright assume that the goat's horned head was underneath the folds of the body portion. Rayburn took a few steps toward the bed, and as she did, there came a thick snort, like an animal rooting in the ground, and she immediately brought her gun up to chest level. Wright did too, a reflex born of long practice. But then he noticed that the supposed corpse on the bed had moved. In seconds, he found himself staring down his gun barrel at a bearded young man, sitting halfway up on the bed, blinking confusedly. "Hey, what's going on?" Wright lowered his weapon, though not completely. "Scott Langley?" he asked. But even before he said it, he knew that it was. Despite the beard and the darkened hair, he had seen enough photos of the boy to recognize those wide green eyes and that bony, hawk-like nose. "What? Who?" The boy sat up fully now, scratching at his scraggly beard, his gaze darting left and right. Rayburn had partially lowered her weapon as well, but she was looking at him quizzically, as if to say, "Yeah, what is going on? Have you lost your mind?" "You're Scott Langley," Wright said. "Your mother's been going crazy looking for you." "I'm William Steyer. You can check my driver's license if you want, it's in my pants pocket." He pointed to a pile of clothes on the floor with a trembling finger. Wright finally reholstered his weapon. "Drop the act, I know who you are. Was the goat suit tonight your idea?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but he could not meet Wright's gaze. "I'd like you to come with us now," Wright said gently. It was all so surreal, talking to this kid who he had been expecting to find rotting in a ditch somewhere for the past 12 months. For a second, he was almost convinced he had made a mistake. But no, he thought, looking at the boy's thin, angular face, so like his mother's. This was definitely Scott. "Am I being arrested for something?" the kid said. "We're just going to have a talk for now," Wright said. "I'm going to call your mother, too, have her come down. She'll be happy to see you, but you're going to have a hell of a lot of explaining to do." Julia sat in the bare police station interrogation room, listening to her son with disbelief. It was strange enough that he was sitting there before her, bearded and considerably thinner, but unmistakably Scott. But the story he was telling was equally unbelievable, diabolical even. "What did you do for money?" Wright was asking. Scott shrugged. "I had some saved up, and I borrowed some from Daryl. Plus I sold some stuff. Once I got to Daryl's house and got my new driver's license, I got a job at the restaurant Daryl manages." Julia sat back in her chair and regarded him bleakly. "You weren't planning on coming back." He wouldn't look at her. "No, I was supposed to be dead, remember?" "What I don't understand is why," Wright said. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? Because you were the one who spilled your blood in the trunk of Zoe's car, weren't you? And you were the one who made sure Alan and Tiffany heard you arguing under the bridge. You even left the glove of the costume in the stream for us to find, and deliberately wrote that diary entry to cast suspicion on Zoe and your father. Why go to all that trouble?" Scott was looking down at his hands. His shoulders were slumped. "I loved Zoe a lot, you know, and to think of her and my dad." Julia saw him shudder, and she almost hated him in that second for making her picture the scenario as he was undoubtedly picturing it. After a long pause, Scott continued, "I just went a little crazy, you know, and then it was too late to turn back, to undo it. At first, I actually thought about killing them both. It would have been easy to do. But it wasn't enough. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted everyone to know. I thought, even if I can't get them convicted for killing me, at least they'll be suspects and everything would come out in the press, and they wouldn't be able to show their faces again." In this, Julia thought his plot had been successful. Bill had lost his job and several friends, even before Julia had kicked him out. And last she heard, Zoe had had to move out of town under the cloud of suspicion that still hung over her. During Scott's entire speech, his thin frame had barely moved. His gaze had not risen. "And what about me, Scott?" Julia said. "Did you think how this would affect me?" "I wasn't even thinking about you." Scott suddenly raised his head and looked at his mother. His eyes were blazing and ringed with red. "The only thing I thought was if Dad was doing that and you didn't know about it, then you were sort of responsible too, for letting it happen." There was another pause in which Scott's ragged breathing could be clearly heard. At last, Wright broke the silence. "And what about tonight, Scott?" The boy finally locked eyes with the inspector. "I thought everyone was forgetting about it," he said flatly. "Zoe and my father were walking around free. Nothing had been in the papers for a while. I didn't want to wear the costume myself in case I got caught, but Daryl's cousin isn't too bright. He would do whatever we said. He didn't know who I was or anything about the case. I wanted someone who didn't have any connection with Scott Langley." He scratched at his beard nervously. Julia was disturbed at how he could speak of himself in the third person so casually, as if his former identity had simply been an old skin he'd since shed. She also wondered if he knew how much trouble he had caused, how much trouble he was in now. "I really wanted my father to see the goat suit. I didn't realize he had gone," Scott went on, glancing at his mother with a faintly approving smile. "I thought it would freak him out a little, make him think he was seeing a ghost or something. I just wanted him to know that things would never be forgotten." He sighed and slumped back down in his chair, clearly exhausted. It was nearly 3 a.m., All Saints' Day. "That's all," he said. There was another long, profound silence in the room. All Julia could hear was Scott's short, hitching breaths and the clank of metal bars somewhere far away. She looked at her son, suddenly reappeared after so long, seemingly back from the dead. As she thought of all he had done, the lives he had ruined over something that may or may not have occurred, she had a horrible vision of him, his face bloated and white above the glossy black fur of his goat costume, resting peacefully and eternally at the bottom of the stream beneath the Woodborough Bridge. Perhaps, she thought, that was where he really was now, and where he really belonged. Perhaps the boy in front of her was merely an imposter, still in costume even beneath the one he'd taken off, a changeling, a devil. She was still thinking along these lines when Wright stood, gestured Scott to his feet, and cuffed the boy's hands behind his back, when he intoned charges that included making a false report, obstructing justice, possessing false identification. Julia went home alone once again, wondering if a black goat would be lurking in the shadows beneath the bridge in her dreams. Jack thought there had been a dead woman on the bed a few moments before, but when he blinked once, twice, keeping his eyes closed for longer on the third blink, imagining her lying there, then opened them again, he realized he must have been mistaken. There was no one there. He even placed a tentative hand on the covers, pink sheets, very feminine, not like him at all. They weren't even warm. He got up and went to the window. The curtains were fussy too, white lace, and he scowled as he pushed them aside. He couldn't see anything through the glass. It was just dark. Not dark like night, but dark like death. No light coming from anywhere, no stars or moon. He let the curtains drop silently back into place. He thought he would go out for a while. He felt very strange and couldn't remember what had happened just now or even earlier in the day. The room around him seemed wrong. It was familiar and somehow not familiar, like a place he had been in as a child or in a dream, but partially forgotten. The door wasn't locked, although it had many locks on it, none were fastened. He opened it and found himself in a hallway, lit with one dim yellowish bulb with no shade, a bulb that looked like it might have come from Thomas Edison's laboratory, fly-specked and grimy with dust. There was a door just like the one he'd come from, directly across the hall. Jack could see that there had once been a number on it, but it had fallen or been pulled off some time long ago. There was still a faint, unreadable ghost of the figures remaining, but to him they looked like characters in some alien language. He closed his own door behind him, and it sounded blasphemous. As soon as he had done so, the door across the hall sprung open, and a squat, disheveled woman stood there, meaty hands grasping her wide hips. "Stop banging that door," she squealed in a voice as tiny as her girth was enormous. "Where's your mother?" Jack blanched. He didn't know this woman. Had she always lived there across the hall? She looked like his mother, but that couldn't be. His mother was at home, in the apartment behind him, lying on the bed on those girlish pink sheets. Jack shook his head to clear it. He felt very muddled. "I don't know," he said, and it came out a bit garbled, but the reply seemed to satisfy the woman, because she immediately retreated back into her own apartment, slamming the door much more loudly than Jack had. The stairwell was steeped in shadow, and Jack nearly lost his footing walking down them. At one point he thought a huge bug ran across the toe of his shoe, but in the dimness it was hard to tell. The floor below the one he'd left looked much the same, with the same ancient light bulb illuminating the same dispirited doors, with the same ghostly gobbledygook where the apartment numbers used to be. Jack thought the place should stink, looking like it did, but he didn't smell anything. He was heading for the next stairwell when he heard the creak of another door opening behind him. He wasn't going to stop, he didn't know any of the people that lived here, but he found himself stopping anyway and turning toward the noise. Another woman was peeking through the crack. She was young, and Jack thought she was pretty, although he couldn't see much of her face. Her hair looked red, and she was smiling at him. "Hey, Jack," she said, and she sounded buttery, velvety. He smiled back at her a bit uncertainly. He didn't know her name. How did she know his? But he said hello back to her because it seemed rude not to. "You should come in for a while," she said, and Jack could still see only a sliver of her face in the crack of the doorway. Some other time," he said. Or at least that's what he thought he said. His own voice sounded odd to him, echoed, with parts of words transposed with other parts. "Just for a while," she wheedled, her smile growing larger. She opened the door a little wider, and Jack could see her whole face now, though her body was still in shadow. She was beautiful, with round blue eyes like a doll's. Her teeth were very white in the dim hallway. "I'm going out," Jack said, and his ears heard nothing but a melange of inscrutable syllables. What was the matter with him? He thought he must be dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. He felt awake enough, he was just confused. Or perhaps he was overtired. What had he been doing earlier? What time was it now? Night, surely. It had been dark outside the window upstairs. He couldn't remember anything except thinking that there had been a dead woman on the bed in his apartment. Or was it his apartment? And there hadn't been a dead woman there after all, had there? He put his hand to his head as if he could massage the truth from it. Maybe he should go back upstairs to check, or to rest until morning when everything would be clearer. "You can't go out there," said the red-headed woman in the doorway. She was still smiling and her voice was still kitten soft, but now her doll's eyes seemed predatory. She opened the door fully and Jack saw that she was completely naked, her fleshy body shaved and pale. He looked away, panicked, but he could still see her in the corner of his vision. She was moving toward him, her nudity particularly obscene in the hallway, under the dirty yellow light where anyone might see her. She didn't seem to care, just kept coming closer. Her breasts seemed gigantic, her mouth stretched too wide, her lips too scarlet. Jack thought he would die if she touched him, then wondered why he had thought it. He shuffled away, still not wanting to appear rude, but at the same time realizing how ridiculous that was. His gaze flickered to the other door on the landing and he telepathically willed someone to open it, to see her and to break the spell that her nakedness was weaving over him. And then, much to his surprise, someone did open it. The man was skinny like a junkie, all knees and elbows and tattered jeans 3 sizes too big for him, and a white tank top that hung on him like a flag of surrender. His head was shorn, his eyes glassy. He looked at the naked red-headed woman as if there was nothing unusual about the situation at all. He sniffed, nodded to acknowledge her, nodded again to Jack. Without speaking, he came out into the hall. As Jack watched, the junkie went right up to the naked woman and grabbed her breast in his bony hand, kneading it hard. His jaw was set as though in fury. She was still smiling and now began making low moaning noises in the back of her throat. Then the man slapped her across the face, the impact like a gunshot, and Jack stepped forward to intervene, trying to form the word "hey," and not sure if he succeeded. But the woman wasn't angry, she just smiled even more savagely. Jack began to back away from them, trembling. Neither noticed him. They stared only at each other, their eyes like 4 glints of some hard metal. The woman whirled on her heel, her red hair flying out behind her like a bloody banner, and she took the junkie by the hand and dragged him behind her, grinning all the while. The pair of them disappeared into her apartment, and the door slammed behind them. Jack stood looking at the closed door for what seemed like forever, his stomach knotted. This place was a crazy house. He felt the panic rising again like the mercury in a thermometer, and in that moment he needed to get out of there, away from the dingy light and the bugs and the lunatics that inhabited the building. Trying to keep his self-control for just a little longer. I'll be out on the street soon, he thought, walking along the normal sidewalks with the normal people, and I never have to come back here again. Even if my mother does live here, I never have to visit her. I'll just go outside and never come back in. He hurried down the stairs to the lowest floor, taking the steps 2 at a time, seeing another even bigger bug but not caring, just ignoring it, jumping over it. The bulb had burned out on the bottom floor, and the hall was bathed in shadows. Jack wasn't aware that there were so many shades of dark. There were windows there, one on either side of the entrance, the blessed entrance to the street. but there was nothing outside the windows, just a blacker black, the same as he'd seen from the window upstairs. The red-haired woman's words came floating back to him, "You can't go out there," and he was afraid, but then he scolded himself. He was just being ridiculous. Of course he could go outside, the door was right there, with the world on the other side of it, and all he had to do was march over there and open the door, and that would be the end of it. He got to the bottom of the steps, his shoes clanging on the corrugated risers. It was very dark, but he could still see the other door in the hallway. There was only one apartment on the first floor, just to the left of the entrance. The exit, Jack thought. I'm going out of it now, so it's the exit. The door of the apartment didn't have a number on it, and there wasn't even a hint of one as there had been on the other doors. For some reason, this bothered him. The door was open a crack, and this bothered him even more. So much, in fact, that he couldn't bring himself to cross the lobby in front of it. The image came to his mind, unbidden, of a huge tentacle or some such monstrous thing slithering from that crack and wrapping itself around his leg, or even his neck, and pulling him toward the door as he kicked and screamed. The people upstairs wouldn't help him. He knew that somehow. He had to get to the exit. He drew himself up and took a deep breath. He was going to have to run for it, hope that he was faster than whatever was lurking in the wedge of darkness and the crack of the door of the only apartment on the bottom floor. He glanced nervously over at it. Was that a movement there in the shadows? Stop it, he thought. Just stop it. There's nothing in there. Someone had probably gone out and left the door ajar, that was all. Or someone's watching you, his inner voice whispered. Right there in the dark, the whites of their eyes wet and shining. Stop it! Gathering his strength, he sprinted for the exit. The lobby seemed so much bigger as he ran than it had looked before, and he kept thinking he was about to reach the door when it was still yards away. He kept checking over his shoulder as he ran, sure that a slimy hand was even now preparing to clamp down on the back of his head, a hand like a corpse's hand, covered with worms and maggots and grave mud. The crack in the door seemed to yawn as wide as a canyon. At last his fingers scraped the wood of the exit door, and it was real and solid and wonderful. He pressed his face against it and let out a laugh that sounded high and shaky, the laugh of a hysterical madman. The doorknob was slick and cold, and though Jack had a moment when he thought it wasn't going to turn, in the end the door swung inward. He stood on the threshold and stared out. There was nothing there. No steps, no street, no buildings, no trees or sky. Just a black like a velvet shroud closing around the face, suffocating, blinding. Jack made to step out into the blackness and found that he could not. The darkness was a solid thing, a wall of nothing. Without being aware of it, a keening noise began in Jack's throat, and he began slapping at the wall with his palms over and over again until they were red and stinging. But still he beat at the barrier, and he keened, and the keen became a wail that bounced off the solid blackness and right back into his nose, his mouth, his lungs, a never-ending loop of call and response. Finally he stopped and slid to the floor, the pain in his hands a faraway echo. The darkness in the hallway of the apartment building didn't seem quite so dark now, and Jack could see the bugs crawling all over the walls and floor, enormous bugs with hairy legs and questing antennae, and beady black eyes like obsidian marbles. They became one with the shadows, moving among them and between them. The door of the numberless apartment was wide open now, and inside was more of the black from outside, a slice of it in the shape of a man-high rectangle. He heard a voice calling him from inside, a voice that seemed made of the darkness, the kind of voice that death would have if it could talk. It was calling his name, and then other voices joined in until it was a chorus, a cacophony, whispers and screams and seductive purrs, calling him like a million radio stations all tuned in at once. Jack got to his feet and shuffled toward the open door. There was nowhere else to go, he knew that now. Ever since he had woken and seen the dead woman on the bed, he had known that things would have to end this way. His shoulders slumped in resignation. He crossed the threshold and swallowed the darkness whole, let it swallow him utterly. The room was the same. The pink sheets, the white lace curtains that fluttered in a gentle breeze he couldn't feel. The sun was out, and a square of blue sky peeked through the lace, the shafts of sunlight falling in stark strips across the figure of the woman on the bed, the squat, fat woman with the perpetual scowl that was now slack and powerless. Jack didn't know how long he'd been sitting there next to his mother, didn't know how long it had been since the last breath had left her body. He touched her arm, still warm but going clammy. He choked back a sob. He had always lived here with his mother, since he was a little boy, in this building with the bugs and the yellow light bulbs that flickered and never worked on the first floor. He knew no other home, was close to no other person. Of course, there was always Darlene, the red-headed girl on the second floor, but she didn't know he existed, not really. He dreamed of her, watched her come and go, but she was older and he was just a child. Jack wondered if she would help him now. He rose from his chair, looking down once at the empty husk that had been his mother until just a few minutes ago, when the electrical impulses that had animated the meat had ceased to function forever. Jack looked out the window again at the beautiful day. Birds chirped as though nothing sad had ever happened and never would happen. Sighing, he crossed the floor, unfastened all the locks on the door, and ran out into the hall, calling for someone to come.